Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we have David Castells-Quintana with us today from the Autonomous University in Barcelona, where he is a professor at the Department of Applied Economics. And his research interests are mostly about urban economics and development economics. He collaborates with a wide range of other institutions like the Sorbonne, Sciences Po in Paris, ISAID, and has published in a wide range of journals. And he's also recently published 2 books. So today, the title of his talk on a joint paper with Maria Lopez-Uribe and Thomas McDermott is on population displacement and urban conflict, global evidence from more than 3,300 flood events. So like always, David will have the floor for around 35 to 40 minutes. In that time, feel free to put any questions in the chat, but we'll answer them afterwards. And then you can also just raise your hand and ask any questions directly there, so we have a more open Q&A. But yeah, David, the floor is yours.
All right, okay. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thanks you guys for inviting me. It's a pleasure to present the paper to you. We were just talking, I would have been in Birmingham. It was my idea to go there a couple of years ago, but unfortunately, situation is as it is. And but anyways, it's nice to be able at least to present it online. Let me tell you briefly from the start what the paper is about. So as the title says, we're going to be looking at floods. So part of the motivation here is climate change and how climate change translates into an increase in the intensity, frequency and intensity of different events. And one of these is flooding, right? So we're going to be looking at flooding worldwide. And the idea is to see how flooding displaces population mainly from rural to urban areas, and see how this population pressure in cities leads to urban conflict. All right. So again, the idea of the paper is pretty simple in that way. Think about flooding. We're going to be looking at major flooding. So basically, you cannot stay where it floods. That's why we focus on flooding, because it's one climatic shock that displaces population. We know people will have to move. And again, so we see how this translates into population pressure in urban areas and how this may lead to conflict there, all right? So, the motivation is basically these trends. First, increasing social conflict, especially in urban areas, especially in large cities in developing countries. We're going to be looking at the data, and this is happening in parallel with rapid urbanization and city growth worldwide, something that probably most of you are familiar with. I call it unplanned city growth because we know that, especially when we look at developing countries, many of these large cities are growing very rapidly without infrastructure. It's in a sort of like unplanned way, not necessarily associated with economic development. And that's, of course, another story, but it relates to what we're going to be discussing here, all right? And so we got conflict, we got urbanization, and we also have climate change, as I was discussing, so deteriorating climatic conditions, which mainly have a stronger impact in rural areas. And as I said, in the case of flooding, this means people have to be displaced mainly to cities. If it's still not clear, let me show you some pictures. So starting from top left, this is examples of flooding, right? As I said, these are flooding events that displace people, as you can see. So these are places where you can no longer stay, at least temporarily. And basically, if you go bottom left, I think this is an interesting picture, how people basically have to move. Now, the idea here is that this displaces people. Usually they move to nearby cities. And again, we're trying to test whether this may be connected to disorders in urban areas. And that's the bottom right picture. So the aim is, as I just said, to test the effect of climatic shock, especially floods, on urban social disorder. The mechanism that we have in mind, as I said, is that floods push or displace population into large cities, all right? And we're gonna be doing this using a large panel of large cities in developing countries, all right? We have several measures of social disorder or conflict in urban areas, all right? The data set includes more than 9,000 events, all right, in more than 100 cities in 89 countries. And we're looking at the period from 1985 to 2015, so it's pretty long time period, all right? As I said, we focus on floods, and I think part of the one strength of the paper, if you allow me to say it like that, is the innovative use of floods data. And I'm gonna probably explain more in the data section, of course, but from the beginning, I want to make clear that we're gonna be distinguishing, because we know, of course, where these floods take place. We're gonna be distinguishing floods that hit the large city, and those are not the ones that we want to study, from floods occurring elsewhere. And we're gonna look at bounds around the city. Again, because the idea is that people are displaced from rural to urban areas, not the other way around. And that's why we're gonna look at those cases in which flooding occurs outside the city that we study, right? And this is gonna be more than 3,300 flood events throughout our 89 countries, throughout our period of analysis. What I'm gonna do is mainly probably briefly tell you something about the literature and the potential contribution of the paper, then go into the data and show you some descriptive analysis, and then jump into the empirical strategy. We're gonna start with a reduced form or a specification of floods and conflict, and then we're gonna assess the role of population pressure, right? Which is what we have in mind, all right? Lastly, we're gonna look at different motives of urban disorder, no? These 9,000 urban conflict events, we know for each of them, we know what's happening, so we can explore that in detail, all right? Or a little bit more in detail. And then finally conclude. All right, so what we know and the potential contribution of the paper. So again, trying to be briefly, we know that climate change and disasters drive conflict. There is evidence, there are nice papers out there, all right? These papers usually look at violent conflict at the national level, right? For instance, focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa and the drying of Sub-Saharan Africa and how that has increased conflict there. There's a lot of evidence on that. We also know that conflict hinders development prospects. There is, of course, theoretical insight here, but also nice empirical papers showing recent evidence about this, all right? Interestingly, we also see that conflict is moving from rural to urban areas, and that's one of the ideas that motivates this paper, all right? So we usually think about, again, violent conflict in rural areas, but nowadays, in many cases, conflict is something smaller that happens in urban areas, right? And these are the sort of disorders that we're gonna be looking at, all right? We also know that weather shocks and weather variation and disasters push population from rural to urban areas. And this is explaining this unplanned city growth. And this is part of my previous research, you know? And so there are some papers here, including myself, and showing how climatic variables can also explain urbanization and city growth, right? And finally, so the idea again is putting all of this together is that the displacement population into cities can increase disorder there. And I cite a few papers here that we found. So there are some theoretical insights in a couple of papers, including a review that we did before. And there is some suggestive evidence in OSPI 2016 and Nani and Lacina 2015. These are one of them is localized for India. The other one is more like a descriptive analysis of some case studies, all right? And recently, Acemoglu and co-authors published a paper with sort of like a similar idea to ours, but they look at historical data and they focus on Mexican regions, all right? But I think that would be the closest in time and in terms of idea to what we do, right? Anyway, so looking at all of these papers, what we found is that there is no paper testing or empirical testing this connection between climate, population, and displacement. If anything, as I said, Acemoglu recently, but looking at cities in Mexico. So and what we want to do here is to do this for a global panel of cities, right? And I think that that's our potential contribution. All right, let's look at the data. So the dependent variable is, as I said, conflict in urban areas. When I say conflict, I'm mainly referring to social disorders, all right? So we use the USD dataset from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And basically this dataset tells you, it gives you info on disorder events in urban areas in more than 100 cities worldwide. And it gives you a lot of information. It gives you information on the intensity, looking, for instance, at the estimated number of people involved. It also tells you the number of fatalities, if there were any, the type of disorder, and it gives you some descriptive information about the disorder. That's part of the work that we did, is going through each of these disorder events and see exactly what they relate to. So some of them relate to prices, some of them relate to, I don't know, lack of public services, some of them relate to ethnicity. You have a little bit of everything, right? And as I said, so you have that information for a lot of disorder events in more than 100 large cities in 89 developing countries. So we're going to be looking at developing countries, all right? So just to clarify that. It's usually the largest city per country, but in some cases, especially large countries like India, China, we have more than one city per country, all right? So looking at this data, we distinguish between the extensive and the intensive margin. I'm going to be focusing on the intensive margin, so the intensity of disorders, all right? And as I said, because we have information, there is classification here. One classification given by the USD is protest, riots, and armed conflict. If you go from the lighter to the more, the armed conflict is, of course, more violent. And then we further classify by the motive of disorder. This is just a map showing you the location of the cities that we're studying, or events in the USD data. As I said, it's mainly developing countries, or basically developing countries. All right, and this is the evolution over time so in the number of events and participants, and you can see, although of course there is a lot of variation here year after year, but you can see a little bit of an upward trend. All right, so related about the floods data, we use data from the Dartmouth Flood Observatory. All right, so this gives you again info on the location, the timing, the duration, and the damage and people killed and displaced for different flood events worldwide from 1985 to 2015. All right, this is a really nice data set with shapefiles and everything that allows you to see exactly where the flood hit. All right, and as I said, this also allows us to distinguish floods that impacted directly on cities versus those that did not hit the city, rural areas around. All right, and we create different measures here. First, a simple measure is the sum of people displaced, all right, by these floods in country I time t, all right? Again, excluding those flood events overlapping with the city that we studied, all right? Then we weight by distance. This makes sense because, of course, if you take the city, we expect that floods happening close to the city will displace more people to that city than floods occurring farther away in the country, right? So especially for large countries, this weighting by distance is important, all right? There is a hand raised, but I think, Caroline, you said we leave the questions to the end?
Yeah, if we could do that at the end, I think.
All right, okay.
Yeah, we'll come back to you, Ellen. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
And finally, and this is our main measure, is this is where we try to nail or get closer to identifying a causal effect. So we use greater population data, and so we do a distance weighted sum of population exposed to floods, and this allows us then to to better identify, again, as I said, the causal effect of floods on conflict. All right. All right. This is flood events, as I said, worldwide. You can see many flood events in Asia, but also in Africa, also in Latin America. And this is the evolution over time, right? And finally, we look at urban population and other data. Remember that the mechanism that we have in mind is population pressure in cities. So we look at city population, and we use two different data sources here. We look at the world urbanization prospects, which allow us to look at city population every 5 years. We interpolate to have annual variation to exploit the floods data and the USD data, but we also show you what we also do some robustness in which we only stick to 5-year periods, all right? And we also use our worlding data on annual population for the largest city per country, all right? And in this case, we lose some cities, but this data set, it is annual. So in this case, we don't need to interpolate, right? And then a bunch of controls from different sources, factors that we think may be related to conflict, right? So GDP per capita, total population, national level conflict, some democracy indicators, some basic infrastructure. These are some descriptive stats. You can see here, for instance, for social disorders, the number of events is 1.88. So it means that, I mean, these cities, you see per period, you see at least one event. And population displaced by floods. Looking at that, this is probably not the best table to tell you that, sorry, but so bear in mind that we're talking about millions. So in every year, and so this flooding event displays millions of people, right? We're not talking about a few individuals, right? In some countries, this is a lot of people being displaced by floods every year, right? It could be in many countries, millions, all right? Let me just show you some associations, all right? So these are bin scatters. So each dot here is about 75 observations, all right? This is to make it more visually appealing, all right? And these include also this control for city-specific characteristics of city fixed effects, all right? So these are associations, but controlling for city effects, all right? The left-hand side panel shows you that people displaced by floods in logs is positively associated with the evolution of population in that city. Again, this is a panel with fixed effects. So understand the log of city population as the evolution over time, right? So this is part of the story. And then the second part of the story is that this population pressure driven by floods will be positively associated with social disorders, right? So basically, this is the story of the paper in a couple of graphs, associations. My job now, of course, is to do some econometrics and convince you that this is somehow robust to econometric analysis, right? And this is what we're gonna do. So we do different set of regressions, all right? First, as I said, the reduced form specification, looking at the effect of floods on disorders, all right? And then studying the mechanism, all right? Which is looking at the role of city growth, right? We're gonna do this using mediation analysis. And finally, classifying the events by motive, as I said, exploiting all descriptive information that we have about these effects, all right? We use the panel, as I said, annual panel or 5-year periods, main variables in logs, different log structures, all right? And we consider the different variables for floods that I told you about, and different specifications, but I'll be showing you city level fixed effects, all right? This is basically the reduced form. Disorders in CTI country J time T as function of floods, all right? Some controls, time and city fixed effects, all right? Let me show you then the results. This is the first set of results. And as you can see here, so what we find is a positive and significant coefficient. And this is consistent throughout for different flood measures, but also for different ways of measuring the intensity of urban disorders, all right? This is the first column is the number of events per million. this is the same, but this I think is don't remember wrong. Sorry, here is with different data sets, yeah. And in all cases, including controls and city and year effects. All right. As I don't know if you can see, sorry, if you can see the note here, the idea is that we're using, so remember that we have to weight by population. So these are number of events per million, and this is also where we use our population data. And here we have different options, right? And that's why you have different columns here. In any case, so a positive and significant association or coefficient here between floods and urban social disorders, right? And this reduced form results are very robust to different samples, to alternative measures, as I said, aggregating over 5 years. We run 2 placebo tests, a spatial and a temporal one. And I think this is interesting, and then we don't find any effect. And I think this was nice. And also we exclude outliers, and in all cases, so if I have time, I'll show you some robustness tables at the end, all right? This is basically the coefficient for different lag structures, so the dynamics. Basically, what I want to show you here is that there seems to be a direct impact, but also more a long run one. And we think that's interesting because that's part of the story as well, right? Some of these, so the kicking from floods to population pressure and then conflict may take some time, and we capture that here as well. So for instance, period T +3 +4, we also capture an effect. What about the magnitude of the effect? We find that 1 standard deviation increase in our exposure to floods variable translates into a short-run increase in the intensity of social disorder events of 16%, all right? If we aggregate over 5 years, as I said, allowing for this effect to materialize in a sort of more long-term effect, so this translates it to up to 33% increase in the intensity of social disorders. So it's quite important effect, right? All right, so next is to look at the mechanism, so the role of unplanned city growth. And we do this using mediation analysis. So the specification that I showed you before, but we're gonna allow for different factors to mediate the impact between floods and disorder, all right? So we're gonna look at observed mediator variables, including city population, to see how we explain that coefficient for floods, all right? And these are the results, the first set of results. So see that in the first columns, I'm basically just replicating the reduced form effect, all right? And then here we introduce city population in this mediation analysis. This is contemporaneous and this is cumulative. And you see how the coefficient is positive and significant, all right? So this is basically telling me that at least part of the effect of that flood has on urban social disorders is operating via the evolution of city population, so population pressure in cities. We also do a push and pull analysis, so using a control function approach. So the idea here is to say, okay, if we find that part of the effect is driven by population growth, we know, and this is again connecting to the literature, we know that also to the literature on how cities grow, and we know that cities grow because of push factors, so people being displaced or pushed from rural to urban areas, right? For instance, because of conflict in rural areas or because of deteriorating climatic conditions in rural areas. But there are also pull factors, so cities also attract people, right? Our story fits with push factors. No, what we have in mind is that this unplanned city growth. No, that cities are growing just not because they are attracting people, but because they are receiving people that are forced to go to the city, right? And so that's what we try to do here. We try to disentangle city population into pull factors. For that, we consider economic growth and infrastructure. A proxy of urban infrastructure in developing countries is sanitation. And for push factors, we look at floods, our variable of interest, and also total population, because again, the story here is population pressure, right? So with this, we disentangle into push and pull driven city growth. And what you can see here in columns 3 and 4 is that The only one that relates to social disorders, this is social disorder events per million, is push-driven city growth, all right? When we put them together, again, so it is push-driven city growth what has a positive and significant coefficient, not pull-driven city growth. Nicely, actually, if you do a simple control function approach by introducing the residual from the first stage, you get a negative and significant coefficient, all right? Sorry about the square here that is crossing here. So basically read these two coefficients. This is telling me that there is a positive association between city population and disorders, controlling for the fact that part of that city growth may be driven by pull factors. So a positive coefficient for push and a negative coefficient for pull factor. So I think that reinforces our story. All right. Lastly, I want to show you some results classifying events by motive of event. As I said, so we have a lot of information for all of these events. So we review information on each of these events and we look what they relate to, okay? So we do two things. First, we distinguish between demonstrations and riots, which fit with our hypothesis, and we leave aside armed conflict because we believe armed conflict could relate to other things, all right? So that's one thing that's, of course, pretty straightforward and easy to do. But then the job is also to look at each of these demonstrations and riots and classify them depending on what they relate to. And we sort of classify them in these categories. The first is public good provision, so basic infrastructure, for instance, access to water, access to sanitation, right? Another one is so people also protest because of prices going up, for instance. There is also disorders related to political sanctions, also to ethnicity and race, religion in some places, trade, this is basically labor market for unions, international migration and corruption, all right? So our story, we believe that our story relates more to this first category. Sorry, I should have ordered them like that. So one is public good provision or the lack of this, right? Prices and wages, because I think this is where population pressure plays a role. Population pressure probably doesn't play such a role when we're looking at sanctions or ethnicity or religion, right? So we're gonna split between this and the rest of demonstrations and riots, right? And we're playing with this. We're doing, at the moment, we're doing heterogeneity analysis, looking at all of these categories. I'll show you what we have so far. All right, so if you take a look at riots and demonstrations, we still have a positive coefficient, but it's no longer significant. And we think here is because sample size is smaller, right? But when we distinguish between, again, what we believe is our story, so public good provision, prices, and jobs and wages, we have our positive coefficient, and here is a negative or non-significant coefficient for other riots and demos. So this is telling us that, yeah, if our story is true, it's through this sort of events, all right? What about the role of population? So again, in both cases, it's positive and significant, and this is no longer significant. So again, this is also not quite reassuring because it's telling us that in this case, city population is capturing most of the impact of floods, all right? This coefficient is no longer significant, and it's city population what becomes significant. So it seems to be, I'm not saying that it's the only channel, but it seems to be a pretty important one. At least here econometrically, it makes the coefficient for floods to go non-significant, and it captures all of the impact here, all right? This is actually decomposing this. So doing mediation analysis, you can decompose the direct and indirect effect of floods, and you look at the different mediators, all right? And this is basically what we do here. See that the indirect effect related to city population, all right? For number 3 is our story, or where we think our story is strongest, so public good provision, prices, and jobs and wages, it's sort of like 100%. So it seems to be mediating all the effect that we found, all right? Again, I'm not saying we're not saying that it's the only one, but in our analysis, it seems to play a very important role. especially again when you look at the motive of disorders, right? For other disorders, all right, then city population plays a smaller role. And I'm going to try to conclude to give some room for discussion. I don't know if I was too quick or not. But so in this paper, so what we do is to study the displacement of population into cities and how this relates to conflict in urban areas, all right, in those cities, right? The idea, as I said, is to test the effect through the displacement of population, people displaced by floods, all right? Again, flooding that occurred elsewhere in the country, not in the city of analysis, all right? And we do this for a large panel of cities in developing countries, all right? We find that flood seems to be a key climatic push factor, so it displaces a lot of population from rural to urban areas, all right? Especially large cities. And we find that this displacement is associated with increased intensity of urban conflict. Urban conflict, especially protests and riots related to public service provision, wages, and it says food prices, but you could think about prices in general, all right? As a policy implication of all of this, we know that the intensity of flooding is going to increase due to climate change, like other climatic shocks. And this will put even more pressure on the current challenges of rapid and unplanned urbanization, especially in developing countries, in large cities where we know they face already a lot of problems, like, for instance, conflict. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. I'm happy to take comments or questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really interesting, and plenty of time for discussion. Ellen, is your question still relevant?
Yes, I can still ask the question, if I may. So thank you very much, David, for the very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is, I think you already addressed that in your conversation, but I still wonder if you can comment something on that. It's how the duration of this displacement on the population. How do you know if it is permanent displacement or temporary displacement? I see that you use population figures, so I imagine that you look at what's the change in the number of population in the city. So I think that partly answers my question. And the other one is more related to causality and this mediation analysis that you do. So to me, as I interpret it, for example, the fact that when you include population of the city to explain, sorry, you are social disorder. Yeah, when you include the population in the city to explain social disorder, to me, as an economist, that sounds more like an omitted variable. I would expect population to have an impact on the amount of public disorder anyway, regardless of floods. You know, so not only the amount of population, but also the growth of this population, how quickly a population accumulates to explain social disorder anyway. So I see it more as an issue of omitted variable bias, and the fact that your initial results, the ones that you present at the beginning, might suffer from endogeneity. And well, I think this concern increases when I see at the end that actually in some of your regressions, when you include population, the significance of the effect of flood actually vanishes. So I'm not sure if you have any.
Let me start with the duration of flooding. So we don't know exactly what people do after. I don't know. We don't know if they come back, or we guess that many of them come back, right? What we do know, as I was saying at the beginning, is that this flooding displaces people. I mean, they have to go, or at least, I mean, they have to go. Whether they come back in 1 month or in 1 year, we don't know, right? But we're guessing that many of them don't come back at least for a long time, right? And as you were saying, because we track the evolution of city population, so we know we can sort of make the guess here, all right? The second one is exactly what we have in mind. So it's exactly what you said. So you can understand it as omitted variable bias, but that's basically the story, no? So omitted variable means that your coefficient is capturing something that should be captured by another variable. So that's the philosophy of the mediation analysis, to say, yeah, I mean, if I run my regression without city population, I am omitting a relevant variable that I have to include. When I include it, so the idea of the mediation analysis is to see what happens to the coefficients, as you said, no? What we see is that when you include city population, that omitted variable, the coefficient of floods goes down a lot. In some cases, it vanishes. So that's the idea of the mediation analysis, to see how including a variable that is relevant, that somehow you omitted, changes the coefficient that you had, all right? If the coefficient that you had go down in size and in significance, it means that your first specifications were misspecified, right? You had omitted variable bias, right? And so you could not trust those coefficients, and now you see what happens to the new coefficient, right? How it sucks if you want the impact. That's basically the philosophy of this mediation analysis, which is, I mean, it's getting a bit popular. We found it in some papers. We sort of had the idea. We ended up implementing. So the graph that I showed you at the end, this is how some papers are implementing this analysis.
Yeah, it's just that at the end, I wonder if once you include all these variables, there is any significant effect of floods at all. Because as you said, in some specifications, it actually vanishes.
It depends. Yeah, it depends. And so we think that relates to the motive of disorder. That's why we do this. So when we look at those events where we think population is very important, or population pressure, right? You see that as you saw, so the coefficient for floods is no longer significant. So, but if you look at other events, then the story may be different. So basically, the idea here is that we know city population plays a role, this population pressure in cities, but especially when we're looking at disorders related to public service provision, because that's related to population. Labor market, the more people, the more unemployment, the lower the wage, so people will protest, and prices as well, no? So we know that there is a population story in these events. By the way, I didn't say, I'm sorry, I have some descriptive down there. These events, although it's just three, so in the classification that we do, this seems like just 3 specific types. These include more than 50%. So more than 50% of the events are related to public service provision or public good provision, prices, and labor market.
All right. Thank you very much, David. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I have one.
I'm not able to see the chat. I don't know.
Was there one in the chat? No, I don't think so.
The Q&A?
No. I had a question quite similar to Ellen's, actually. So I was wondering about the timing of the mediation analysis. I think the first question is just, is the city size variable, are you including that in levels or in changes? And like, I think in general, how should I think about the timing? Is that all basically in the same year? So there's a flood, city population increases, and then there's more, conflict, or does that happen over a period of time? Right. That's probably, maybe you could just go
sure.
through that.
No, that's a really good comment. I mean, we also didn't know, we had this in mind. I mean, it is something that happens in the same year. It is something, so that's why we ended up doing sort of like these dynamics. What we found is that if you do it year by year, there seems to be a direct impact, contemporaneous impact the same year. It could be, I mean, the shock is such that it creates some sort of waves that lead to conflict straight away, all right? Maybe it comes down a little bit in so the year after and the second year after, we don't find an effect, but the effect comes back in year 3 and year 4. It seems a bit odd, no? That it's positive, then non-significant, and then positive. It may be an issue of just how well, I mean, standard errors here, basically, how precise the estimates are, right? But it could, I mean, we could also see a story here, as I said. Maybe there is a contemporaneous effect because, I mean, the flooding takes place and people have to adapt and all that. And then this effect in year 3 and year 4 could be actually the outcome of this population pressure. So once people got to the city, got a place to live, they calm down, blah, blah, blah. After some years, they start protesting, okay, I don't have electricity, I need to find a job, or these immigrants are stealing my job. No? These immigrants are rural people that just arrived. So maybe it takes time for the effect to materialize. So but exactly, I mean, we taking a look at some examples to see exactly what is happening, and some examples sort of support what we have in mind. But yeah, but I mean, you have everything. So throughout the events, it's difficult to generalize. When you look at 5-year aggregates, so you see, of course, the impact is positive in period 1, of course, because period 1 is already 5 years. So in a way, my co-authors prefer the annual panel. Of course, you have more observations and you can do a lot of things. But my personal point of view, my co-author is not there in the audience. I like this one more because it's neat, no? In the sense that it's 5-year aggregate, it's a more medium, long-term effect, and it just goes from nothing to positive and significant, and then goes down. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Thank you. Did you also show the effects of the flooding on the population itself, or you're just assuming that that intermediate step is there?
You mean so something like this, the relationship between people?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, something. I don't know to what extent we changed. We played with the dynamics here, but it's a good point. I could go back to that to see if there are also some dynamics here. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that would make it more convincing that really,
sure,
that's
sure.
the sequence of events. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
There's also a question from Simon.
Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Thanks, David. I enjoyed that. So I
Thanks.
guess stepping back a bit, rather than asking a technical question about the details, just stepping back about the implications of the findings, 2 things occurs to me. One is movement of people, mass migrations right now, for example, Ukraine, are relatively common over time. This suggests that you've got a fairly useful set of tools to understand the knock-on effects spatially between exit of a group of people from one sub-region to another region, creating an economic shock in the recipient region. In a lot of cases, that's different countries, but it might be regions in the same country. So in a sense, I mean, I have 2 questions. The first, they're both about, extrapolating from the findings to understand what are the insights and findings and recommendations for policymakers in terms of improving resilience. So in a sense, if you're receiving a huge influx of migrants, there is clearly a knock-on effect to the recipient area in terms of an economic and social shock. And what do you do as a policymaker to alleviate the problems that causes? The second question is related to that, because in a sense, one of the objectives at City-REDI is to try and understand the relative improvements you can make or the costs that you can reduce by early interventions. And in this case, it seems to me there might be some potential to understand, if there's any way, this is a long way from your research, I guess, if you could put a cost on the additional social, political, and economic disruption in the recipient city, that presumably would add weight to arguments to invest more in flood defenses in those areas away from the cities where the people are migrating from. Because at the moment, we don't account fully for the total social, economic, and political cost of those sorts of disruptions. And policymakers would probably like that kind of ammunition in pushing forward cases for flood defenses in other parts of the country.
Sure. Thank you very much. Really, really interesting comments, Simon. I don't know if I'll be able to say much, but yeah, I think that's part of the. So in terms of policy implications, as you said, I mean, I actually just agree with you. I'm an urban economist, no, and we look, like many of you, we look at cities and we focus on the problems that take place in cities, no. This research, like many other related research, shows that if you want to solve the problems of cities, you have to look at what happens in rural areas. So yeah, I totally agree on that, and that's part of the implication here. I don't know. I'm originally from Bogota in Colombia, right? Bogota, like any large city in the developing world, suffers millions of problems, right? And Bogota keeps increasing, and there is population pressure there, and blah blah. And when they discuss the problems of Bogota, it's like if Bogota was isolated, right? And that's the story. Like I tell my fellow Colombians is like, if you want to solve the problems of Bogota, you have to solve the problems of the surroundings and the rest of the country, right? Because the Bogota is the default option. They don't know what to do because there is conflict. They move to Bogota. I mean, there is an issue with a climatic disorder. They will move to Bogota. So for sure, yeah, all the interventions that we can do in rural areas are not only good for rural areas, but it will also alleviate the problems of urban areas, especially large cities. So totally agree on that.
No, very helpful. We talk in terms of trade-offs, and in some ways the interesting question for policymakers would, in Bogota or Nairobi or elsewhere, is, are we better to invest in flood defenses, or is there more mileage in investing in skills, or is there more mileage in investing in transport infrastructure or poverty alleviation? And that leads you to a very, very complex set of trade-offs, which are very difficult to map and very difficult to apply data to. But I mean, I think making some headway on that and assisting policymakers do the best interventions over the best timescales to alleviate systemic problems in cities in these countries is critical. It's exactly parallel in the UK, but the scale and scope of the depravity is a different planet, having lived in Nairobi for a long time and visited many other countries. So in some ways, the urgency of getting that puzzle right is more important in the third world.
I would say that in these trade-offs, actually there is some plus to interventions in rural areas. That is, if you invest in urban areas, so that's great, of course. I mean, I don't know, provide more infrastructure, more job opportunities and all that. That solves a problem but creates another one, because then it's a pull factor. So
Yeah.
you will attract more people,
Yeah.
so it's a Malthusian story here, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, it's like solve the problem before they come, right? Sounds a little bit bad. I'm not against immigration, whether it's national or international. But what I'm saying is that these interventions in rural areas will solve two problems at the same time. Maybe you improve the lives of rural population, but also, I mean, by doing that, you don't translate the problem to cities.
Interesting. Thank you. I'll give someone else a turn. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? I think relating to what Simon also just said, the interviews, the regressions on your push and pull factors are really interesting, because, you know, if there's no negative effect in cities that have a strong pull factor, it's almost an efficient effect, right? Like, I mean, not that the floodings are efficient, but, you know, people have this push to leave that rural area probably because of that negative effect. But then if the city actually has a strong pull factor, that's probably ultimately the better outcome for people, you know, if they can be more productive there, if the cities aren't overcrowded and we don't see those negative effects. I don't know if you thought about that. Maybe you could also explain a bit more how you define those. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, that, you know, in successful cities, apparently you don't seem to have any of those negative effects.
Exactly. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I agree. Yeah. One thing is population size, and we know that the larger the city, they're more prone to different problems, like, for instance, conflict. So that's also, of course, one reason to do this by million. No, we do events per million, right? But the other thing is how the city looks like, right? Exactly what we mean by population growth, right? Again, this is also, I mean, a critique to like when we work, including myself, no, when we work with population data, city population data, say, okay, I'm a city of 2 million inhabitants. Yeah, okay, but that could be Birmingham. I don't know, Birmingham, the city, I don't know if it's around that, more?
A little bit less, I think.
A little bit less. Is that Birmingham, or is that, I don't know, Medellin in Colombia? Is that what exactly? I mean, 2 million, that doesn't tell me much, all right? Especially, I mean, in dynamics, no, when the city grows. And so that's what we're trying to capture here. So larger will for sure be more difficult to handle, that we know, right? But if the city is growing big, I mean, with infrastructure, there is economic growth, there are things taking place, job opportunities, well, the propensity and the intensity of conflict will be lower. That's what we capture in here.
Yeah, no, really interesting.
know if there are any other questions or comments. Anyway, thanks for the comments. We are in the process of revising this. We still have to do a little bit more of work, especially in looking at motives of events. But yeah, hopefully so far get this finished soon.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you very
luck with
much,
it,
and hope to see you, some of you, next time in person. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being here. And yeah, we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. You all get the reminder. Yeah, good luck with the paper, David. Thanks for coming today. And see you all. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.